Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley, and I am the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. I was recently on vacation and reading a psychology magazine. Yeah, I'm such a psychology geek that I enjoy reading about it even when I'm relaxing by a pool. An article that captured my attention was one on how to apologize well. I kept thinking about it long after I finished the article, so I looked up the article's author, Dr. Molly Howes, and found she has written a great book on apologies. As soon as I got home, I read the book and contacted her for the interview you'll hear in a few minutes. In the book, Dr. Howes describes the 4 steps on delivering a good apology. It is such a crucial topic. Whether at work or at home, it's our relationships that truly matter. And the ability to apologize is a skill every one of us will inevitably need. So, knowing how to apologize can make the difference between a great relationship and a lost relationship. My guest, Dr. Molly Howes, is a Harvard-trained clinical psychologist who has written the ultimate guide with clear examples of how and how not to apologize in her book, A Good Apology. The book has been hailed by the press and luminaries in psychology like Dr. Edward Hallowell, who describes it as the definitive book on how to make an apology that actually matters. And Dr. Chris Germer, who echoes my own thoughts by saying, I hope the whole world reads this book. So join Molly and me as we engage in a lively and informative conversation about the essential skill of apologizing. Dr. Molly Howes, who has asked me to call her Molly, welcome to Super Psyched.
It's great to be here with you, Adam.
So glad. I was counting the fact that I was reading an article written by you while I was on vacation, and I just looked at my wife and said, and my wife, by the way, for those of you not familiar, she's also a psychologist who works a lot with couples. I said, honey, you've got to read this article. And immediately when I got home, I bought your book, A Good Apology, 4 Steps to Make Things Right. Could not love it more. I think this is a prerequisite for being human. Everybody needs to read this book. Before I go into the first question, there were 2 quotes that you attributed, one to James Baldwin, which was, not everything faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Winston Churchill once said, courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. And these 2 quotes, amongst many other brilliant quotes that you bring in, add so much value to your book and provide so much context to what we need to do and what can interfere in what's most important in life, which is our relationships.
I love that you chose those.
You do?
You chose those, yeah. But because there's such wisdom in those quotes, in those writers and speakers. And there's a lot of good, sound advice around in the world. And my goal was to bring some of it together so that people could get it in one place. Sort of the most important message.
Well, you succeeded beyond measure. My first question is this. Why is apologizing so difficult? It's so difficult that Chicago wrote a song called Hard to Say I'm Sorry back in the 80s. But I'm wondering what thoughts and feelings typically get in the way from making an apology, let alone a good apology.
Well, the first problem is we don't see our mistakes. Literally, we don't perceive them. Neuroscientists tell us that our brains are designed to be efficient. And going back and looking for some mistake you might have made or an error or a harmful action is inefficient. So just basically, our brains are not designed to allow us to rethink. We override that, but it's not our first path. Secondly, those cognitive functions and perceptual ones are just skewed. We're skewed for confirmation bias. We're skewed to resolve cognitive dissonance in some simplistic way rather than holding both and other things like that people may be familiar with, whoever took a psychology class. And we perceive things that are wrong. We trust our senses when perhaps we shouldn't, because often we're just wrong. And we're often very confident that we're right when we're wrong. So those are just hardwired problems. It's the cost of being human. It's not stubbornness. And then on top of that, there's stubbornness.
Right.
And there are cultural factors that lead us to believe lots of myths about apologies, including that an apology is a sign of weakness, or that real presidents don't apologize for their countries, or real men don't apologize, or, there's lots of sort of mistakes we have in terms of understanding what it means to make amends.
I think that's so crucial. And it's interesting that we don't see ourselves clearly. All we need to do is see ourselves on video, and we can be quickly, we can be quickly disabused of the idea that we actually look a particular way. And when you talk about these biases that our very buggy brains can provide, these confirmation biases, can you just really quickly address what is confirmation bias?
It means if you already have an idea about what's going to happen, you're likely to see that as what actually happens, as when it unfolds. There's a strong possibility you're going to distort reality. If anything is ambiguous, you're going to see it the way you thought it was going to be.
Funny, I just did an episode on how, in spite of the fact that our brains are pretty amazing, they are still buggy and full of biases. So let's talk about why it's so important to apologize. Before we get into what apologizing is, kind of in the Simon Sinek idea, let's start with why is apology so important?
It's really important because we hurt each other often. And often it's by mistake and it causes harm. It damages relationships. It often makes us lose relationships. And it's harm that doesn't have to stay where it starts. I think the most important take-home message from this book is once something has gone wrong between you and somebody else, that doesn't have to be the end of the story. We often settle for that. We think there's no way past it. But in fact, if you can repair what you harmed, even if it was by mistake, if you can fix it or heal it, then there's another chapter that you can write together that's very likely to be better, almost certain to be better. So I guess it's important because it's powerful. It's within our capacity to do. And lots of connections will be stronger, building a better base for communities. All kinds of things will be better.
I'm thinking of a song that was really big in the 80s. It was AEIOU and sometimes Y. And one of the lyrics was, "It's a miracle that we communicate at all." And I think about apology as being a very high level form of communication because the injuring party needs to recognize that they've done something wrong and overcome their cognitive biases. And the injured party may actually need to ask for an apology because the injuring party may not even realize it, that anything has transpired. And let's talk about the injured party and requesting an apology. There are a lot of roadblocks to doing that. Oh my gosh. Can the relationship sustain this? Will they think that I take things too seriously and I'm too much of a heavy? What are the roadblocks that may inhibit a person for asking for an apology when one is actually warranted?
Well, one thing is that we don't witness very many repairs. We don't witness them in our homes and we don't witness them in public done very well. So it would make sense for someone not to have a lot of faith that it's going to work. And if you don't think it's going to work, why bother to expose you for it, But for another thing, until a pair of people has practiced a little bit, even with small things, they don't actually know how to do it together. They don't know how to anticipate what the other person will say and feel and what it'll mean to them. But once they start practicing, it's actually pretty smooth. It's not a big deal. I mean, it takes some effort and deliberate focus, but it's not fancy. It's not high level. What's required are very simple things. But first, what's required before those simple things is turning one's attention to it in a kind of optimistic way, in a way that holds the potential for healing in it.
I love that optimism that you're talking about and the trust that it will actually work and that the relationship itself can contain that type of a conversation. And, some people like David Schnarch, who recently passed, referred to a relationship as being potentially a crucible that could handle very hot metals. And I often like to think about the types of skills that you're imparting in this book as being like PPE, personal protective equipment, kind of gloves, a smock, and perhaps some goggles to help people with combustible conversations. And then I think about the other big roadblock, and that is shame. And in the book, you very beautifully differentiate guilt and shame, something I talk about a lot, which makes me really feel like you're a sister from another mister. But can you share a little bit about how guilt and shame may help or actually, in many cases, inhibit one's ability to apologize or to even ask for an apology?
Sure. What psychologists often say, and you may and I do say, is that shame is feeling bad about who you are and guilt is feeling bad about what you did. So, and shame, even from a very young age, causes little people, children, to look down and get smaller and not try anymore, even from the very beginning of our lives. It's not a productive kind of feeling. It's wasteful because it prevents anything different from happening once you feel so bad. In contrast, guilt can be very productive because that kind of prickling of your conscience and the slight awareness that maybe you did something that you didn't mean to do or caused something that you didn't mean to cause or did something in anger that you regret or even took a misstep on purpose that you now regret. Those awarenesses can guide you and goad you into trying to fix them. It leads you to reach out. If you don't, then it builds up and it becomes something more kind of toxic and pernicious. But the guilt itself can be good guilt. It can be exactly what you need to make the first step towards someone to make a repair. And I agree with you. I think the other person can feel shame too. The person who's been hurt sometimes can feel that she or he has deserved it or doesn't deserve to have it repaired or somehow caused it and so is reluctant to ask for it to be made right.
Yeah. And I think of shame, just as you said it so beautifully. I mean, we could be fully grown adults with incredible life experience and degrees after our name and feel like we are 8 years old. And it's such a shrinking experience and a cleaving and shame really, it's like it doesn't want to see the light of day. And guilt can be such a meaningful signal that can compel us to relieve our guilt by speaking. I love that you cited the studies of criminals who had higher levels of guilt and a lower rate of returning to prison, and that can be a really meaningful measure. Whereas shame oftentimes is so toxic that we just don't want to face it at all. And we just try to hide it away and compartmentalize it, and it just festers. So I'm really grateful to you for that. Before we get into what a good apology sounds like, I'm sure you've received a bad apology at some time in your life. I know I have. I remember one of my favorites was, "I'm sorry you felt that way." Right? I'm sure I have as well. But let's hear some typical bad apologies, or like, what does a bad apology sound like?
Well, one very common one is, "I'm sorry, but," because anything that follows the but negates the "I'm sorry," I think. No, there's no but. Just "I'm sorry." And "I'm sorry if" is similar.
Mm-hmm.
"I'm sorry you felt that way" it could be kind of going toward a good apology, but it's more likely to be implying, "I'm sorry you're such a sensitive weakling."
I love the fact that you brought up the "I'm sorry, but," and how the but negates everything that preceded it. And I think that unwittingly, the apologizer is feeling so much guilt or shame in the moment that they can't quite fully own it. And that impedes them from being able. And you also describe the difference between actually a healing and a debate or some type of intellectual discourse around a topic rather than addressing the feelings straight on.
Or legalistic,
Legalistic.
Who's really at fault here? And what led this to occur? And all that stuff is reasonable in court, but it's lousy in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not useful. And it may be good sometime later when you're trying to parse it and write a narrative together about what happened, but not when you're trying to make something right with someone. Then it's got to be simple and direct and about the pain you caused.
And I think that timing is everything. And it's almost like a triage. We address the emotions first, and maybe we can zoom out later and go into the intellectual and kind of the contextual. But at the very beginning, we really need to talk from feeling to feeling. That's kind of what I gleaned from your book. Is that?
Yeah, I like that. I like that. And also, the other thing that isn't relevant is justifications for why I did what I did, which is a feeling. That's kind of feeling based, but I don't think that's the feeling that you meant.
Right.
Empathy and compassion.
Yeah. And the feeling I meant was really zooming in onto the feeling of the person who felt hurt and staying there and tolerating the discomfort if you are the person who's apologizing for the sake of recognizing that this is what it takes. So let's talk about the good apology. What are the 4 steps?
The first step doesn't involve saying anything. It involves listening. And listening is a set of skills that is not highly valued in our culture. Culture moves fast. We want to say snappy, clever things that catch people's attention. And listening is very different from that. Often it's differently paced. So even to begin requires us to slow down. And I'm aware I just slowed that sentence way down on purpose because that's the kind of quality of attention that we're going for. You usually have to ask the other person to tell you. So you have to say something to ask them. But most of what you're doing is listening and you're not arguing with, but that's not what I meant. Taking out of context. But you know I didn't mean it. You know, those things. What you're doing is trying to understand what their experience is. And that kind of inquiry takes some time and attention. It doesn't take rocket science, but it takes a deliberate turning toward that. And because that's not where we usually start with an apology, we usually start defensive. If someone tells you you've done something that hurt them, usually my response is to feel defensive about it. And so you have to make a turn. And that turn is the hardest part of this whole process. Once you've done that, the rest of it's smoother.
I love that you isolated listening as step 1 to really hear. And I'm guessing that part of listening would be even the ability to feed back what you've heard, paraphrase what you've heard to the person conveying it and asking, did I get that right?
Right. Like that couples therapy kind of dialogue method that we teach people sometimes.
Right.
The active listening and responding and clarifying and checking, you know.
And you and I are both fans of a previous guest, Harville Hendricks and Helen Hunt, who were both on podcasts previously. So yes, I'm with you on that. That's a very important skill.
And it's very powerful to the person who's been hurt to be able to speak about what happened. It's curative in many situations, including historic, horrible abuse, pain things that have happened. For example, the Truth and Reconciliation trials after apartheid, not just in interpersonal situations, but speaking what happened to you is a very powerfully healing action. And being listened to, having your experience witnessed is meaningful.
Oftentimes we think we need to be so creative, so clever. And really what we need to do is just be a witness.
Yeah.
Let a person know that they've been heard and they've been seen and that they've been felt. Wow. Like what a gift. No bigger gift.
Yeah. And it's hard to do if you're busy thinking, oh my God, I'm the person that caused that. But it's not really about you. Step 1 is not about you at all. So if you can get yourself out of the frame and just think about this person that you care about who's hurt, you know, empathy follows naturally.
And I love one of the things that you talked about earlier is just overcoming that perfectionistic tendency to think, oh my gosh, I must be a horrible person and therefore feeling shame, or I need to be perfect to be okay. I need to be perfect to be loved. And just remembering that all relationships involve injuries from time to time. And it's the ability to regroup that is so crucial. And just maybe as a mantra, as a person is listening, they could say to themselves, I'm wondering something akin to, I'm human. This is normal. These things happen and we can get through this, or something like that.
I actually would go even a step further that if you don't have mistakes and hurts in a relationship, you don't have the necessary fuel to build a lasting mutuality. I think you need them. So it's a good thing. And so It's not just that we can tolerate a mistake. It's that we need them in order to learn about each other.
Yeah. It's as if we really don't know who the other person is unless we've seen some differences between each other, because there are individual differences and they will show up at some time and they may cause hurt. Excellent. So step one is listening. What is
step two? Is what we usually think of as an apology, speaking your remorse and your caring about the other person's experience. And it's simple, and it doesn't include all those qualifications or explanations or attributions of blame. It's very simple. The statement, "I am so sorry I hurt you," is powerful. It's simple, and if it's heartfelt, it works. You can say, "I had no idea, and now that I know, I am so sorry." You can do that, but you can't go as far as saying, "It wasn't my fault, I didn't mean to, I would never." That detracts from the point you want to make. The point you want, I care about the impact on you that I had, and I'm taking responsibility for it.
Beautiful. There's a title of a book on cognitive dissonance called "Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me."
Not by me.
It's the full embodiment of, I stand before you, my dear person, as a witness to what you've just told me, who's just heard you, and I take full responsibility.
Right. And it occurs in other settings too, as you know. There's value in taking responsibility for your missteps in a spiritual sense, as well as in this more emotional, interpersonal sense. It's an ancient, almost universe process in world religions, for example.
Mm-hmm.
A way to face your wrongdoing or misdeeds or mistakes and own up to it.
And it's ubiquitous. And one of the things that you've brought up is something that the legal system may wish to pay attention to, and that is that the punitive action of the legal system may be half-baked, that there is something so important about hearing the person who's engaged in some wrongdoing, really own up to it, to the person who's been harmed.
Right.
And that can be such a big deal of just
the legal system. Yes. And the legal system prevents it. In fact, we keep the victim apart from the perpetrator. And the victim, if you will, it's maybe not the best word, but the person who's been hurt doesn't have a lot of influence over what happens in the legal system. They don't get to say, "Oh yeah, now I feel better." I mean, they get to do a victim impact statement sometimes during sentencing, but we're not going for the same thing there. We're going for punishment and holding people accountable as an external thing rather than helping them hold themselves accountable. And that's why restorative justice models are so much more effective for all parties. It's amazing how powerful they are.
And I like that you use the term harmed rather than you course corrected when you said victim, because we tend to use the word victim. And that's a very disempowering term, but the harmed party, it would be great if that became more used in the vernacular, I think, psychologically anyway.
In our restorative justice program, the one that I volunteer in, we call it the impacted party.
Impacted party, that's even better. So step 2 is speaking remorse. And what is step 3?
Step 3 approaches that issue you just raised about punishment, because the goal there is to make the wrong right. And that's different from being punished. There's potentially a little bit of overlap, but the purpose there is to restore what was broken. In a legal situation, you restore someone usually financially or materially to what their previous status was. But in a relationship, what you're trying to do is restore trust, restore the balance, and in fact, grow it. Sometimes that involves making restitution of a material thing that was broken or lost or needs to be replaced somehow. And often that's a symbolic replacement rather than a monetary one or financial one. But more often in a relationship problem that you're repairing, what people do is a do-over. You get a mulligan. You try again to do the thing that you didn't do well before. And if you're lucky, your partner, whoever, will let you try again. It's incredibly corny and people resist it because it seems silly, but it's so powerful. It's
totally. The do-over's huge.
Yes.
Yeah. It reminds us of our childhood, perhaps, but it may remind us of our childhood, but it's really profound if you really are willing to go with it.
Yeah, because you enact it together. You enact a different reality. The reality is actually changed by doing that.
Yeah. And I wouldn't go so far that say that if you're willing to enact the reality, that our brains may go with it and say, okay, we've just rewired something that had been torn apart. And I'm thinking also about in terms of restoration, since so much of our hurt is interpersonal and oftentimes not physical. A guy I work with told me of having said something to his wife that made her feel somehow demeaned in a public setting amongst friends. And part of his restoration was to, first of all, he heard his wife. He went through the steps. He listened. He spoke remorse. And then he called the witnesses. He asked for her permission. Yeah. And then he called the witnesses and said, you saw me speak to my wife in a manner that was totally unacceptable. And I take full responsibility for it. She in no way, shape or form deserved that. And I apologize to you for even having to have seen that. And I wish to restore my wife. You know, she had difficulty even looking at anybody afterwards because she felt so humiliated. And that was entirely my responsibility. And that was helpful to the relationship because she felt betrayed and there was a breach in trust. And we'll see how it goes over time. But I have a funny feeling that it's going to cause greater growth over time.
Right. Because he's going to learn something important here, or it already has, maybe.
Definitely.
And these kinds of things happen in public settings too, where somebody's mistreated. Somebody mistreats somebody. Person A mistreats person B, and so has to make something right with person B. But everybody else who witnessed it also was damaged in a way, and the group was damaged. The tenor of the culture has changed, and that takes some work to fix. And so if you just do it to the person on the side, you know, it doesn't really fix it as with your friend. But also one time of saying it might not do it in the group either. You might need to go do step 4.
Yeah. So let's hear what step 4 is.
Which would be making sure it isn't repeated. You know, setting up systems that'll prevent the hurt from recurring. So in that work setting, for example, if the manager or the boss talks over someone frequently and that person feels put down and hurt by it, not only does the manager have to say, check with the person first after you make it right with that one person, has to say to the larger group, I regret doing that. I can see that that's impolite and doesn't promote good problem solving, whatever. So I'm going to try not to do that anymore. Then the next step is for her or him to say, so I want you guys to call me on it. Let's keep a count of how many times I interrupt somebody in a meeting, or there's going to be safe, available channels for letting me know when I screw up.
I love that.
You know, just ways to fix it first, but then ways to make sure it doesn't happen again. There's lots of creative ways to do that, collaboratively or otherwise.
And you're really speaking to the ecosystem, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we all live in one, even if it's just a group of 3, a group of 5, whatever it might be. You also very beautifully weave in some important ideas. And that is in a group setting, to your point about work, that it's not the teams that make fewer mistakes, but actually the teams that make more mistakes that tend to be more productive. It's just a question of the candor within that community. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah.
What did you mean by candor? And you really kind of differentiated that from psychological safety within the group, but rather candor as being a measure.
Yeah, that term psychological safety is what they use in the research, but they don't mean coziness. You know, they mean candor. They mean telling people the truth. And radical candor is now a term that it's a title of a book, and it's in the business world is a similar catchphrase. And what it means is there is allowance for, welcoming of, and encouragement of criticism and disagreement and conflict, which allows all the ideas to get on the table and allows people to kind of find a way to make the most of those disagreements. And conflict resolution, or dealing with conflict management, I guess is the right term, is the highest rated weak point of business executives. By themselves rated. They don't feel confident. They don't know what to do with it. And so what happens is a culture evolves that does not promote conflict resolution, promotes conflict avoidance. and lots of things build up. People end up feeling, disenfranchised. They leave, or there's a big blow up and then there's harm done that can't ever be fixed. It gets to be because people leave and there's no trust. So radical candor is telling people the truth early on. And that means the boss has to be inviting truth early on, truth that is unpleasant for him or her, that isn't favorable.
And what are some of the traits of the boss who is good at doing this? Because I imagine a lot of bosses will say, you can say anything you want. And lo and behold, there are negative repercussions for saying exactly what's on a person's mind, even though it was solicited. Yeah. So I'm wondering, how can a boss stay true to that and really cultivate a culture that allows for this type of radical candor, which we have evidence creates better business practices and probably, I would imagine, a reduction in attrition for teams and a whole host of other positive things. But I imagine a lot of people aspire to this, but actually in real time fail to execute. How can a boss better execute on this idea?
It's an interesting problem. And it's sort of like that cultural problem that interferes with apologies. I think there has to be a combination of courage and humility. And we don't think of them as going together.
Right.
But it's actually a very strong adult, mature position to be able to take it, to be curious about things you don't know and to encourage people to tell you things as if you didn't know them because you don't. And that doesn't take anything away from your power if you're confident in your strength already. And those kinds of business leaders are more effective. I tell you what, I had no idea about the sound and beautiful literature in business management until I was writing this book. I thought only psychologists wrote this kind of stuff. Some of them are psychologists, but it's just lovely, some of the writings about these kinds of traits. And these are the things that people should have in families too. Somebody doesn't always have to be right in the family. They can ask, and then they can learn something.
And, we have so many figures in the media, TV, movies, in the real world who kind of show this, I am courageous because I'm fearless. And actually, we know that courage requires fear. If you're fearless, you can't be courageous. And vulnerability is a precondition for courage. And I love that you paired courage and humility, because oftentimes we don't see these as coexisting, and actually they coexist very well if it's done right. Like the best leaders can really rock those traits. And I love that you're saying that you're seeing the loveliness in the literature around positive business practices, because it is gorgeous. And it's my hope that more and more businesses in the future, especially as AI begins to rise, incorporate positive leadership practices, because the options are all across the table. And oftentimes I see a chasm between what people aspire to do within leadership positions and what they actually do day to day. It's almost like, well, let's just get through this crisis and then we'll start being, we'll start treating people kindly.
Exactly. No, I think that's very common. And I was just asked to consult to an organization, which I can't name, but where they're under a lot of pressure. And so what they call the niceties get skipped. It takes a lot of presence to keep your perspective when you're under pressure.
Definitely. So let's go back to the apology on the interpersonal front and just kind of one-on-one. What happens when the apology has been delivered? All 4 steps have been properly attended to, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, the impacted party is still just not feeling it and not ready to fully resume. Perhaps it's been an affair, which can be a really big rupture in trust. Talk about that. What does...
Yeah. I think for starters, it's a pretty good idea to bear in mind that it might not be a one-try repair. Maimonides has said you have to do it three times. Yeah, three times. I mean, you have to know that the words aren't magic. Saying the right things and doing the right things doesn't make the hurt go away. It lays the groundwork for growing something better. But if the hurt is big enough, it just takes time. And it takes time in more than one way. For one thing, often the other person isn't really ready at the time that the apology is initiated. And so I encourage people who are receiving an apology to control the timing, and people who are trying to make one to invite the other person to control the timing. Tell me when it would be a good time for me to talk to you about this, because I want to make it right, but I want to make it right at a time that'll work for you. You know, you don't want to repeat some disrespectful thing by forcing it on somebody when they're not ready. And oftentimes, the person who's receiving the apology is so grateful and so appreciative that their beloved is trying so hard to be open that they say, okay, fine. Yes, that's great. Fine. That's plenty. I got it. You're good. No more problem. Way early. They do it before it's really done and accept it and want it to be over as much as the apologizer wants it to be over. And I think it's really better to be thorough, to take the time that you need, even in the very, very beginning, but all along. After infidelity, boy, it takes a long time. And I think the patience of the apologizer, the ability to hold steady and hear about the hurt more than once, often many times, in that case, makes the difference.
Such a good point. You also reveal some cases in which perhaps an apology is not a good idea. When is an apology a bad idea?
Well, one case is if the person has told you they do not want contact with you. You know, it's on you to honor that. Another one is, it's sort of related, and that is if you think it would cause them harm, you know, raise a painful subject that they're better off not thinking about again. I think that's a little bit dicey though, because often people use that as an excuse not to make an apology. Right. They probably should make. So I think in that case, if there's a question about that, then the inquiry has to be very gentle. There has to be a soft opening. You know, I was been thinking about this thing, and even if it was a long time ago, I've been thinking about this thing that happened between us, and I'd like to try to make it right. And I wonder if you'd be interested in talking. And if you're not, I regret it, and I do not need to talk to you about it anymore. You know, so the other person gets the choice, right?
Totally. The power and an easy out.
Yeah. In cases of abuse, it's even more so. The person who's been harmed has the right to not engage at all. It's no obligation.
Yeah. And you also reveal some great examples of sometimes where it's less about the recipient receiving the apology and more about the apologizer relieving themselves of guilt. And that might be a bad time to apologize. I think you folks, I'm just going to reiterate my plea that you read this book, even though Molly and I are discussing it at quite some depth. This has to be read because for several reasons. The book itself covers so much more, but also in the face of needing to apologize, we need to really dive deep into this information because so much anxiety shows up. And what do we know? We know that in the face of anxiety, it's hard to deliver, and we need to be able to deliver well because this skill is, you know, a black belt skill that requires attention, intention, and the best of what our humanity has to offer.
Several people have told me that it was very helpful that the book has scripts. You know, after each chapter of one of the steps, there are actually some possible scripts. And they're my words, so you don't want to use my words, but there's at least presented a model for how you might execute each one of these, what kinds of words you might say. And in the workshops that I lead about this, it's really valuable for people to hear possibilities, even from other people in the group. You know, we can crowdsource. How might you approach something? Because actually finding words is kind of hard sometimes. And speaking from your heart is great and will do, but it's handy to have some other words.
Could not agree more. Molly, you and I are both fans of the TV show Ted Lasso. And off air, you and I were talking about how he embodies so much of what your book is about. Could you just speak briefly to that idea?
Not only he, the character, Ted Lasso, but also other characters and other relationships in that show demonstrate the power of owning your mistakes and facing them with somebody in a totally gracious way and taking the heat and making it right with someone, and all the good relationships in that show.
Beautiful. I could not agree more. We humans tend to mimic other people while I love watching shows like Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones, watching Ted Lasso might be just a nice way to remind ourselves of what it looks like to rock humanity at its best.
We don't have that many good apologies. We don't have a lot of that. So it's really refreshing.
Mm-hmm. So Molly, my final and fantastical question. If you could magically confer upon all humanity one skill as it pertains to apologizing, what would it be? And how do you imagine it would positively impact individuals as well as society at large?
The courage to face one's flaws and failings and mistakes with sort of clear-eyed courage is crucial. And it makes you a better person, makes you more responsible. If we could do that, we might not have to have retaliation.
So true. And the festering of negative feelings over time.
Yeah, across all kinds, on all levels, country to country, people to people, group to group. If we could say, oh, yep, got me there. I blew it. We try again. And it just seems like lots of hardship and even war, could be avoided.
I love that you described that from heads of state. The importance of this skill is absolutely relevant. And it's a sign of strength rather than weakness. So if it's true for them, it's certainly true for us. Molly, I can't thank you enough for having written this book, had taken the time, invested your heart and your brain, and provided, as I like to think of it, cookies nice and low on the shelf for us to grab so that we can take them and be better for having done so. As I part, I'm going to share a quote that changed my life. It came from my supervisor, and it was, it doesn't matter what we say or do. It matters how we talk about what we said or did. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it does matter what we say or do, and that doesn't apply to everything, but it really speaks to the power of the repair, and that there is a lot more optimism for our capacities to repair. And I think that your book speaks beautifully to that point. And thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with my listeners.
I'm so glad it spoke to you.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.